Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel and a new video. Hope you're all well. In this video, we're going to show you how to remove the BIOS administrator password on an HP ProBook 440 G6. Now this will also work on the 450 G6, G7s, and quite a few of the HP ProBook and EliteBook laptops. So let's get into it. So to remove the BIOS administrator password, we actually need to take the laptop apart and we need to remove one of the BIOS chips from the motherboard and reprogram it. Now on these EliteBook, ProBook laptops, there's no simple way of actually doing it through the operating system or through a boot disk because the actual BIOS itself is embedded onto the BIOS chip, which means we need to remove that from the motherboard and we need to put that chip into a programmer to reprogram it to actually delete the BIOS password off of it. So to do this, obviously we're going to need to remove, as I say, the BIOS chip from the motherboard, and we also need one of these. This is a BIOS reprogrammer. This model is the TL8662 Plus model. You can get them from eBay. You can get them, they're relatively cheap. I think this one was about 40 quid. And you'll need an adapter as well. So most of these come in some kind of kit with these little adapters as well, which you plug into the BIOS programmer to program the IC, but we'll show you that a little bit later on. Right, so first things first, what we need to do is actually get the motherboard out of this ProBook. I'll skip fast forward through it because it's lots of screws, lots of cables, but I'll come back to you when I actually get to the BIOS chip part. Right, so just very quickly, here we are inside. Obviously we've got our battery, we've got our solid state M.2 hard drive, RAM, Wi-Fi card, obviously fan and heatsink. So all of this has got to come out because we need to get to the motherboard. So that's the motherboard removed. Relatively straightforward. Now what we need to do is actually locate the BIOS chip. So on these EliteBooks and ProBooks, there's sometimes a couple of ICs which could be the BIOS chips. I'm just going to remove these shields to make life a little bit easier for us, because it's probably located under one of these. Can stick that back on later. Now the BIOS chip is usually got 8 pins on it, or 8 legs, sorry, I should say, on it. And it usually has a little bit of a marking on there, right, like a little dot. Right, now, there's this IC here, which certainly looks like a BIOS. There's also, if you flip it over, one here that could possibly be a BIOS. Right, and you kind of get to know them after a while, because you know what they look like after you've done this a few times. But essentially, see this IC here meets the characteristics of having 8 legs. There's ones over here, but I think they're MOSFETs because they're close to these inductors. And then flipping it over, there's this one here. So what I'll do, I will just check under the microscope quickly so I can read the numbers off of the chips, and then we can identify exactly which one is the BIOS chip. So looking under the microscope, that is our BIOS chip just there. Let's just zoom you in a little bit so you can see that a little bit clearer. That one just there, and it is the SSOP package. As I say, 128 megabytes. This actual model IC, and they might differ, right? So this motherboard, as you know, is out of the HP ProBook 440 G6. The actual model of the IC might change slightly. This one's a Giga device. This one is a 25B127D SIG chip. They might differ slightly from model to model, depending on obviously what's available to HP at the time of manufacture. But there you go. It's just by the wireless port there. That's what we're going to do. We'll put some tape over that so we don't damage that port, and then we are going to remove this IC and get it into our programmer. So let's just put a little bit of heat-proof tape over the wireless LAN connector, just to protect it a little bit from the heat. And then we're going to come in with our heat gun and remove that IC. So what I like to do is just add a little bit of flux along the legs, just to help the solder melt. We're going to come in with our heat gun. We're going to put our heat gun at around 480 degrees, and we're going to drop our airflow to around 70%, I say. I'm just going to spin it around a little bit so it's a bit easier to grab with the tweezers. There we go, easy as that. So now we've got the IC off the board. Right, so there's a couple of markings on here, or one marking we need to look out for. There's a little dot on the IC which indicates pin 1 on the IC. And then what we need to do is get our SOP 8 adapter and then align pin 1 to the top left hand pin on here. So we drop that into our adapter, release the pins, and just make sure they're all aligned. So as you can see, we've got the dot, pin 1 aligned to the top left hand side, and then the adapter then goes into the programmer like so. We drop that down, and pin 1 has always got to be up here, right, to the top left hand side of the programmer. Right, so just do a quick double check. Our dot there on the IC is there, and it's obviously pointing this way, top left on the programmer. Right, so now what we need to do is jump across to the PC and get a reading off of this BIOS chip, first of all. So we take the reading off of it, and then we're going to dump back onto it a BIOS which has not got the BIOS password set. Right, so here we are over on the PC. Now, to remove the admin BIOS password, we're going to need a couple of files. Obviously, you're going to need the software for your TL8662 Plus programmer. But you're also going to need a little utility, which you can find over on badcaps.net. I'll put a link in the description below. This utility, called RCUnlock, will actually automatically remove the password stored in your BIOS file for you. It was created by Rhetorical Cheese. So big shout out to you, and thanks very much for all the work you've put into creating this file. Really do appreciate it. Nice little utility. So what we need to do first of all is actually get a copy of the BIOS from our original IC, which we just removed from the motherboard. So we're going to need to run the programmer software. Obviously, after the program is all connected to your PC, first things first is select the type of IC, so the BIOS IC that we need. So if we click up here, we can actually select and search for the manufacturer that we need. Now, as mentioned earlier, our one is a Giga device, and it is the GD25B127D. So we need to search for that. So we'll go back to the utility, search for Giga device, and it will bring up all of the Giga device model of ICs they create. And it is, as I say, the GD25B127. So GD25B127, and it is a SOIC8 is the one we need. Let's just double check that. GD25B127D. GD25B127D. So we select that, and then we literally come up here and click read, right? Because we want a copy of our BIOS first of all. And here you can see a little image of the BIOS chip in my reader. As I said, pin 1, top left. Click read. Off it will go and actually read the BIOS in its current state. And this is obviously the state with it still including the admin password, which is fine. And then it will come up and say read finished. So we can click back. And then as you can see here, there is now a load of data which is read from the BIOS. So what you want to do first thing is actually save this file, which is now loaded into the programmer software. My recommendations is you save it somewhere that you can remember. So let's just go to our desktop. We have a file called BIOS Unlocker. Save it into a folder, something like, call it original, right? And then give it the name of the actual laptop is what I normally do. So HP ProBook 440 G6 original, right? So that's the original one. Click save, and then the file has been saved to our folder on our desktop just here. So there we have our file on the desktop. Now what you don't want to do is modify this file at all. You just want to leave it as is, so you've always got a backup in case the next step goes wrong. So as I say, over on badcaps.net you'll need to create yourself a username so you can actually download this file. So create yourself an account, they're free. Once you logged in with your username, download this file and then extract it to a folder on your desktop, which I've done here. Just here. So RCUnlocker, these are all the contents of the file. What we're mainly interested in is this one file here, right? So what I'm going to do, I am going to take a copy of this, right, which is our original file, which we've just saved. Okay. And then I'm going to paste it into this folder over here, because what we need to do is you grab the file, drag it, and then drop it on top of RCUnlocker.exe. Right, just literally let go of the thing of your mouse button, and then it will come up and bring you up this little window. Now what this does is obviously tell you that it's obviously read the model of your laptop from the BIOS file that we've just dropped onto the unlocker file. And I'll need to blur this out obviously because I don't want to share all of the details of the serial number, but essentially a load of information about your laptop that you just copied the BIOS from, and then it gives you a nice message to say the unlocker's finished. One thing to point out, so after we reinstall the BIOS and reprogram our BIOS, we need to go into the security tab and reset all the security settings to default. Right, so you can close that window, and then what you'll notice now, here we have another file that's been created, right? But it's got the underscore unlocked wording after it. The file size is exactly the same as our original, so we've still got our original. That's completely intact still, that hasn't changed. But we've got this unlocked .bim file, and that's the file now which we're going to reprogram back onto our BIOS IC. Into our programmer, we load that file that's just been created, right? So file, load files, and then we will browse to our newly created file. We saved it here under the RCUnlock folder, and there we go, the unlocked file, right? So make sure you select the unlocked one, not the original one, unlocked, and then open that up. Leave all of these defaults, that's fine, click OK. Now what that does, it's loaded the file into the programmer memory, and then we now need to program it back to the BIOS chip. So up here, click program. It still remembers the model number from previously, and then we simply click program. What it will do, first of all, it will go and erase our BIOS IC, so it's blanked out nice and clean to take the new unlocked BIOS file, and then it will go through and then program the file. And then once that's finished, it comes up, programming succeeded. So it's obviously erased the BIOS chip, it's programmed the BIOS chip, and then it's verified the data it put onto the BIOS chip corresponds to the new unlocked file that we loaded into the programmer, and then says programming succeeded. So we click back and then we can simply shut all this down and then go back to the laptop to resolder back on the BIOS chip. Right, so here we are, back over by the motherboard. What we need to do is pop the BIOS IC out of the programmer, like so. And then we need to put this back into place on our motherboard, obviously making sure we get the IC round the right way with pin 1. We're going to get ourselves a little bit of flux, and we're just going to add it along by the pins, and then we're going to come back in with our heat gun again, and we're just going to solder this back into place. Okay, so it was a tiny little bit out of line, but it's always good to check. So that's all nice and lined up now. So now what we need to do is get the motherboard back into the laptop. Right, so that is the laptop all put back together. Now let's go and plug it in and see if the admin BIOS password has been removed. Right, let's turn it on and see what happens. We're going to keep pushing F10 constantly because we want to get into the BIOS. Entering setup. Let's exit out from a self-test. And there we are, into the BIOS. Perfect, there you go. BIOS password removed. So one of the tips that we saw is obviously setting all the defaults. So what I'm going to do is select apply custom defaults and exit. And let's do factory defaults. Apply factory defaults and exit. And then we're going to say yes. And there we go. So a couple of reboots because it obviously wipes out all the other settings that are in the BIOS. and they are back into the BIOS without it asking us for a password. So perfect, there you go. So real quick video to show you how to remove the administrator BIOS password from an HP ProBook 440 G6 laptop. As I say, this will also work for the G50s and quite a few of the other EliteBook and ProBook model laptops, probably all the way up to G7, G8 models, so the later generations as well. I hope you found that video useful. Please consider giving us a thumbs up and subscribing to the channel. It really does help us out. Please feel free to share this video. Thanks very much for watching. Take care of yourselves. Bye bye for now.